I want you to picture a scene with me for a second. Heavy rain is falling on the old Ashford Cemetery. Gray clouds are hanging incredibly low over the hills, and there's this bitter, cold wind pushing fallen leaves right across the wet grass. Now, there was a man in this town who attended every single funeral, and I don't just mean some of them. I'm not talking about just the funerals of his family or close friends. I mean every single one. Honestly, it didn't even matter if the person in that casket was a local billionaire, a homeless veteran, a school teacher, or someone nobody else seemed to even remember. He always showed up. He always wore the exact same perfectly pressed black suit. He always carried a single white rose, and without fail, he always stood in the very last row.
So naturally, why was he always there? It was the exact question that had the entire town whispering. You see, for almost 20 years, absolutely no one knew his name. Kids in the neighborhood whispered that he was literally a ghost. The adults, well, they just assumed he was maybe a retired undertaker or just a profoundly lonely guy, because he always managed to disappear before anyone could walk up and actually speak to him. He never introduced himself, he never stayed for the reception afterwards. He was, for all intents and purposes, just a shadow. And nobody knew the real truth. That is, until one deeply, deeply tragic day.
Section 1. The Stranger in Black.
That 2-decade-long silence finally broke at the funeral of a 12-year-old girl named Lily Harper. 19, that's the number. Only 19 people actually attended her funeral. Just think about how heartbreaking that is. 19 people showing up for a little girl who had just spent 2 agonizing years fighting leukemia. Her mother was sitting entirely silently in the front row, clearly having not slept in days. Her father was just staring blankly at the ground, not even blinking. Because, sometimes grief just becomes way too heavy for tears. And then, people noticed him. The man in the black suit, last row, white rose in his hand, completely motionless. As the funeral wrapped up and the cars slowly started to drive away, only Lily's parents remained behind. Oh, and the stranger. He waited patiently, walked right up to the grave, knelt down in the wet grass, and placed his white rose gently beside her photograph. But as he turned to leave, for the very first time in 20 years, someone actually stopped him. Lily's mother looked right at him and asked, "Did you know my daughter?" He looked back at the grave and very calmly replied, "No, I wish I had." "Then, why are you here?" Lily's mother asked him, completely bewildered. The man just looked up at the gray sky for a moment, and finally he answered, "Because nobody deserves to leave this world without someone remembering them." It literally sent chills down her spine, because that was the very first complete sentence anyone in the entire town had ever heard him speak.
Part 2. The Hidden Foundation.
Well, from that exact moment on, the town was utterly obsessed. I mean, who wouldn't be? Who was this guy, and why every single funeral? So a local reporter named Emily Carter decided she was going to get to the bottom of this. She actually tailed the stranger's black sedan right after he attended the rather empty funeral of a local mechanic. And his car didn't pull up to some massive mansion or a church like she might have expected. It stopped outside this unassuming, small brick building with really faded blue paint. And out front, there was a sign that simply read, "Second Chance Foundation." Emily walks inside and she finds this incredibly warm room, just totally filled with children's drawings and donated toys. A volunteer there told her the mysterious man's name was Mr. Walker. Emily, probing for answers, asked if he worked there. The volunteer just laughed softly and said no. He built this place. He pays every single bill: school supplies, emergency food, college scholarships. As it turns out, he had been anonymously funding the entire town's emergencies. But right as Emily was heading for the door, the volunteer stopped her with one last massive secret. What was inside the anonymous envelopes? You see, the volunteer explained that every single family in Ashford that loses a loved one receives a blank envelope in the mail. No return address, nothing. And inside, it's always a cashier's check with enough money to completely cover their funeral expenses. And tucked right inside those envelopes, along with the money, was always one specific sentence: "No one should say goodbye alone." Emily just stood there, completely frozen. Suddenly, this wasn't just a quirky story about a mysterious stranger anymore. This was clearly about a man who was carrying a grief so impossibly enormous, he had literally spent decades making absolutely sure that no other family ever experienced what he once had. But what on earth happened to him? The answer to that was waiting down in a dusty, forgotten basement.
Section 3. The Forgotten Journal. So, Emily heads straight down to the Ashford Public Library archives. After digging through all the current records and finding absolutely nothing, an elderly librarian brings out this faded, battered cardboard box that hadn't been touched in 28 years. Stamped right on the side of it, it said, "Unclaimed 1996." Emily opens the lid, and inside she finds the visceral, heartbreaking remnants of a completely shattered life. We're talking old hospital records, a tiny pair of pink baby shoes, and a really worn-out leather journal. She opens it up, and on the very first page, written in neat blue ink, it says, "If anyone ever reads this, please remember her."
Going through his journal revealed this agonizing, slow-motion tragedy. March 18, his daughter Emma's 5th birthday. He wrote about how he burned these star-shaped pancakes and how she laughed so hard she actually fell off her chair. His entry that night read, "I thought happiness lasted forever." But then, just a few pages later, the handwriting completely changes. It gets shaky, frantic. April 2, leukemia diagnosis. He wrote that he didn't even know how to spell the word. Page after page, he detailed the chemotherapy, the terrifying fear, and a desperate father just trying to stay strong for his little girl. And then, the handwriting becomes almost unreadable. November 14. The hospital called him at 3:12 a.m. He was out working an overnight shift just to keep the lights on and pay the towering medical bills. By the time he finally rushed through the hospital doors, she was already gone. The nurses told him she'd kept asking if Daddy was coming, but he wasn't there.
6. The day of Emma's funeral, the rain was pouring down, and only 6 people came. And to make it worse, most of them left before the burial even finished. He stood there and watched total strangers just walk away, getting back into their cars while his little girl was lowered into the cold ground. Emily sat in that quiet archive room and read the final, heartbroken paragraph in the entire journal. That day, I promised Emma something. As long as I'm alive, no person in this town will ever be buried without someone standing beside them, even if they never know my name. That was it. The white roses, the anonymous donations, attending every single funeral, the 20 long years of total silence. He wasn't just out there saving strangers. He was keeping a desperate, lifelong promise to his little girl.
Part 4. A Father's Promise. Now, Emily was staring down a massive ethical dilemma. She was sitting alone in her office long after the sun went down. Literally, with one click of her mouse, she could publish the absolute biggest story of her entire career. We're talking national television, millions of views, the whole 9 yards. But every single time she reached for her keyboard, she just kept hearing his promise echoing in her head. So the next morning, she got in her car and drove out to the cemetery. Sure enough, Mr. Walker was there, attending a service for an elderly schoolteacher. Emily quietly stepped forward, confessed that she had found and read his journal, and she asked him the one question on her mind. Why did he never tell anyone? He just looked out over the rows of gravestones and quietly replied, "Because grief isn't a performance, it's something you carry, and kindness loses its meaning when people expect applause." Without another word, Emily handed the journal right back to him. She chose human kindness over the headlines, and for the very first time, a single, silent tear rolled down the old man's weathered face.
Section 5. The Final Goodbye. So, life in the town moved on, though things were a bit different now. You'd see local children starting to leave small white flowers by the cemetery gate, kind of quietly copying his incredible kindness. And then, about 2 years later, the church bells rang for him. Samuel Walker had passed away at the age of 72. His obituary in the local paper, it was only 3 sentences long. There was no grand list of his life's achievements, no mention whatsoever of the foundation he built. Just one final request. Please, don't spend money on flowers. If you wish to honor me, stand beside someone who thinks they're alone.
Well, the morning of his funeral arrived, and something genuinely extraordinary happened. The roads leading to the cemetery were completely deadlocked, just clogged with cars and buses. And the crazy thing is, no one officially organized it. Word just spread quietly from person to person. By the time the memorial service actually began, 3,000 people were standing together on that wet grass. School teachers, veterans, waitresses, the countless families he had secretly kept afloat, and the people who had opened those anonymous envelopes in their darkest hours. 3,000 people showed up for the man who always stood alone in the back row. Emily was there too. She stood right where he always did, in the very last row, holding a single white rose. When the ceremony finally ended, nobody moved. Nobody left. For 15 breathtaking minutes, the entire cemetery was completely, utterly silent. The only sound was the wind moving through the trees.
Then, a little girl, probably no older than 7, walked forward and placed a white rose right on Samuel Walker's grave. Another child followed her, and then another, and then hundreds. Within minutes, his grave literally disappeared. It was completely buried beneath thousands and thousands of white roses. The town was finally returning his lifelong favor.
Part 6. The White Rose Legacy. True to her word, Emily never published his journal. Instead, she started something called the White Rose Project. It became this incredible grassroots movement that spread to dozens of towns all across America, where everyday volunteers simply refused to let others suffer in silence. It leaves us with a pretty powerful question, doesn't it? Will you stand beside someone who thinks they're alone? You know, if you happen to visit the old Ashford Cemetery today, you'll see that almost every single grave has at least one white flower resting on it. Because when it all comes down to it, we are remembered far less for what we owned and so much more for the lives we quietly touched along the way. If this story moved your heart today, please leave a like, share it with someone you really care about, and subscribe to this channel for more unforgettable explainers. Because sometimes, one small quiet act of kindness becomes a legacy that outlives us all.